I had 21 years in federal law enforcement, in fraud risk management and investigation roles with people like the Australian Federal Police, Defence, Immigration, etc. So I've been in the fraud game a long time. 10 years with KPMG now as the leader of fraud investigations and fraud risk management services to government, both nationally, both federal and state. So when I make some comments, I do speak with some knowledge of some of the risks that apply. So let's talk about the risks. The risk of fraud to government and private sector and the community in general is very significant. And yet, despite what we see through headlines such as this one, we still see many examples of people being very ignorant about how big the fraud risk is, what it looks like, and what they should be doing to try and manage that risk, often with catastrophic consequences. And I don't think we need to run out the newsreel of recent events for people to know what I'm talking about when I talk about some catastrophic public sector cases that have occurred over the last few years. So what I want to talk to you about first is what does the risk look like, and then Jeff will talk to you more about what was the results of the work that we did. So I'm going to talk about the KPMG fraud survey. The 2012 fraud survey is the most recent in a history of fraud surveys we've done going back to 1993, and through the surveys we've been able to look at the progression of fraud throughout the years. Normally our survey only looks at the last 2 years, which we did in this one, but this time we went back to the start and said, well, what's happened over those years, what's changed, what can we learn from it, and how does it map perhaps to the economics of our society to see if there's any correlation there. So what are the highlights in the survey? The first one is we've seen an increase in fraud, so up to around that 370 million in the last 2 years. That is an increase over 2010, which was the previously highest year, but then we've got to look back to 2001 to see the next highest year. So there's a bit of a question there, what's happened in the intervening period. Last year, or the last 2 years, a massive increase in frauds over $1 million. So as opposed to people taking $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, they've really got access to take a lot of money and they're getting out there and taking it from you. There's an increase in the older age perpetrators, the more mature minds as we call them. Internal fraud still presents the biggest fraud risk in terms of the single biggest hit to the organisation. That's been the way it's been through all of history. What we're seeing is just a bit of an increase in that. We're seeing a growth in collusion, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but very much so that people understand what the control mechanisms look like and then working their way around those control mechanisms. We've seen an increase in what's described as bribery and corruption type behaviour, so not strictly the legal technical sense of bribery and corruption, but certainly an increase in what people are considering is inappropriate conduct in that space happening here in Australia, which according to Transparency International is one of the safest places in the world. On the positive side, and I have to put a positive message in there, we are seeing an increase in fraud awareness training. We'll talk a bit about that later. Fraud awareness training is a very good method of fraud control. So what does a typical fraudster look like? First of all, we're seeing that there's three times more men than women, according to the survey, that are committing fraud. As I said, increase in internal fraud, not dramatic increase in my view, but certainly a common theme that a lot of the times we're looking external, but it is internal. And why is it internal? Because the people internal to you know your control systems, have the keys to the safe, have access to your accounts, and can set up fake documents, etc. very easily, much easier than an external person can. So, what else do they look like? 91% with no history of dishonesty. So there's a couple of questions about that. Is it a first time for them? Have they never been caught before? How good are our pre-employment screening tests? So often we'll get a criminal check. If they've never been prosecuted and recorded, then we'll never know that perhaps they're a fraudster. Whereas other checks like bankruptcy and litigation and proper checks with referees might disclose that perhaps they do have some other area of dishonesty about them. We're seeing that they're earning around that $100,000, so they're not the people that are really destitute within our organisations, they're not the low-level people, they're becoming the more senior people. And when we talk about the over 55ers, they're earning $200,000 plus in a lot of organisations, so they've got a fair bit of money, and I'll come back to some of my views on that. And we are certainly seeing that they're driven by greed, lifestyle, personal financial pressure. That doesn't change a lot. Every now and then gambling pops up as a big one, but that's often driven by a lot of things. But certainly over the history of the survey, that's been a very common motivator. So let's get on to the over 55ers. Back in 2010, they represented 3% of the major frauds. And when you look at the survey, it does distinguish between fraud in general and a major fraud. So a major fraud in the survey is the single biggest fraud that any organisation has been hit with. So they might report 50 frauds and we'll ask them about their single biggest one to get some details. So a reasonable increase in the numbers they're involved in and a significant increase in the amount of money they're getting away with. So these people represent the more senior people in the organisation. They've been around quite a while, they're well connected, they're older, they're trusted. What were they driven about before? They were really driven by greed and lifestyle. They've never been through the depression years, they've never had to do it really tough, and they simply want to keep going. So greed drove them in the early days, and what's happening now is that personal financial pressure to maintain that lifestyle they're used to is really starting to creep in. There's been a decrease in the number of people operating on their own and an increase in the number of people that are colluding. In 2010 it took us 400 days roughly to detect a collusive fraud. Last time, 665 days, so a massive increase in the time it takes to detect collusive fraud. Why is that the case? Because everyone is thinking about traditional fraud risks. They're thinking about the person who's acting alone, they're thinking about standard controls, and when the profile changes, we're not recognising what the change is, and we're not putting in controls which will then go and detect collusions. This is a survey courtesy of the Australian Institute of Criminology. I did a joint presentation with them recently where they actually mapped their survey history and some broader history against our survey. And you'll see there back in 1999, fraud in the federal government, 153 million roughly, and then in 2009 and 10, nearly $500 million. So that's a significant increase in the federal government system. And if you know much about the federal government system, they've had mandatory fraud control arrangements in place for about 15 years. So they've been in that game a long time. So potentially they're detecting more, but it just shows you that even with their focus on fraud control, they're still getting a massive increase. And as you see with the survey there, it does correlate to what we've seen over the years ourselves. So how do we manage the risk? The prevention, detection and response strategy was developed by us around 10 or so years ago. I was involved in that development, and that then became the platform for what is now the Australian Standard on Fraud and Corruption Control. Since that time we've updated the Australian National Audit Office's Better Practice Guide on Fraud Control in Government, and we use that, and the reason I tell you this story is that we've used that to assist the Queensland Audit Office in undertaking its recent performance audit in Queensland Government. Now it's a fairly simple process if you think about it, and the chart I've put up there is the Braithwaite model on regulatory compliance, which we use in law enforcement, and we've converted it to use it in fraud control. And it's a pretty simple logic. If people know what you want them to do, if you have rules in place and you provide leadership, they will self-regulate. Most people will do what you want them to do. Does that make sense? If we want people to drive at the speed limit, we tell them it's 60, we put up a sign, we make sure they do a licence test, and most people drive around 60 kilometres an hour. So it's a very effective way of regulating people and getting them to do what you want them to do. So that's things like integrity, fraud awareness training, etc., etc., and we'll talk a bit more about that. Then you'll always get people that will break the law. You'll always get the young guy who wants to burn around his car a bit faster, so you've got to put a police car out there with a radar, still fairly cost effective, or a speed camera, and you'll get them under your net. They'll start to behave themselves. So in fraud control, that's about detection, management reviews, audits, data analytics, those sorts of things, to say, okay, well, we know you're going to push the boundaries, so we'll keep an eye on you and make sure you behave yourselves. And then you're going to have people who will commit fraud. So you need to be able to respond. You've got to have a fraud response program. 2 levels in this one, a discipline process, so the public service discipline process works quite well here for minor infractions, and then of course a law enforcement prosecution response for major infractions. And when I talk about minor infractions, if you start picking up people for misconduct, and we do see a correlation between misconduct and fraud, you'll get them in line fairly quickly before they go on to commit the major frauds. So that's the theory with which we built the prevention, detection and response model. Of course, in the law enforcement game, going back to our policing model, that's where you have the major traffic accidents and all that, and you can see the cost of that is quite expensive. So if you think about the cost of getting everyone to drive at 60 compared to the cost of cleaning up major traffic accidents, it's much higher. Same in fraud control. The investment in prevention and detection is far better business than just waiting for it to go wrong and living with the consequences. So what does the model look like? This is the model which Jeff will talk to you about in a minute, and it's based around prevention, detection and response. So the attributes in there are divided up, heavily weighted towards prevention attributes, then some detection attributes, and really only 2 response attributes, investigation and insurance. So what you do, and Jeff will go into detail what we did here, but what we've done elsewhere is assess the organisation as it stands, so looking at that and saying, well, that's where you sit, And on a 1 to 5 scale, you need to be around 3 to be in a reasonable space, but you should be better in some areas. Then you can write your own plan and improve yourself over a period of time to where you really want to be. Now, in that model, you wouldn't be 5. That'd be absolutely, I can't think of anything else you could possibly do. That's probably overkill, unless, as some of our clients have been, subject to severe public and regulatory scrutiny where they need to be in that space. But normally, if you look about that yellow area, that's about where you'd want to be if you're in better practice fraud control.